And welcome to this episode of the Good Citizen Podcast. Today I want to dive into 6 remarkable moments in American history. As we are counting down to the 250th anniversary of our country, I wanted to go back and look backwards at 6 particular events that I think mark our history. This is about identity, and an identity that helps form our future behavior. Who are we as a people? What have we done in the past? Now, whenever you dive into American history, there are always questions. All right, you picked these 6. Why'd you pick these 6? And why don't you talk about these others? Well, so these are 6 that inspire me. And I decided in celebrating the United States, I'm not going to go into some of the darker chapters of American history. We've said often that the United States is an experiment that is imperfect but impressive. And certainly themes like slavery are wrapped up in some of these issues that we're going to talk about. But I do believe that American history is worth celebrating, and I've actually been a little melancholy in a sense that the celebration thus far in 2026 has been, I think, muted. We don't know that. Well, can we celebrate? Can we be patriotic? We have our politics and all of the division in the country, and so I am a little melancholy about that fact thus far. Maybe that'll change, and we'll see some great celebrations coming up. But this is one way I wanted to look back and just commemorate our history and the remarkable men and women that shaped it, the providential moments that sent the United States on a path from 13 small colonies to a world power that has planted its flag on another world, in a sense, on the moon. And so what an incredible story as you look back through the tyranny-torn, sin-stained pages of history that's so cyclical in nature to see the rise of these 13 small colonies to a world power. So let's jump in. The first one that I want to talk about is the signing of the Declaration of Independence. We'll start at the very beginning. Now again, ho-hum, we've studied this a lot. So we all know how this story turned out. But those that signed it, those that were signing up to fight England, did not. And you have to maybe just spend a second in their shoes. We've talked about this from time to time, but Britain had just won the 7 Years' War, a conflict that Winston Churchill later called the first true world war. It was fought all the way from India to the Caribbean. So here from this conflict arises England. England emerges as the victor, as a world power, certainly with massive debts, but with colonies across the world. The term that the sun never set on the British Empire wasn't in vogue yet, but it was true in a sense that they had colonies all around the world. Britain possessed overwhelming military and naval superiority. There would have been something like 140 to 180 ships of the line in the British Navy at this time, a standing military. It could project its power globally. It was also an economic powerhouse. It was among the wealthiest nations on earth. London was a major financial center. Its trade network spanned North America, Caribbean, Europe, Africa, and Asia, generating enormous revenue. Again, we've talked about the Royal Navy. It was the leading navy in the world, large standing army. Up against that, you have 13 small colonies, right? No navy to speak of. We also had no national government under the Articles. No established army worthy of comparison, limited manufacturing capacity, and then still significant internal divisions. I don't know that we talk enough about the Tories and that there are many Americans, even American clergy, that remain loyal to the crown. So all of that, and yet the founders signed off on this document, declaring themselves a new nation, saying that the king had abdicated his role here for all of the reasons they list in the Declaration, the 27 there. One of the key ones is that he hires these Hessian mercenaries to bring against his own people. And so that particular moment where, based on our principles, based on this idea of human freedom, that we are created equal, these American founders signed off on the document declaring independence. There was absolutely no certainty. Now, it's one thing to say, okay, we're going to declare independence after we win the war. No, this is before they win the war. And there's every reason to believe that this is going to fail, that many of them will be hung, killed for treason. There is a quip supposedly by Benjamin Franklin. He says, we should all hang together or we shall assuredly all hang separately. And then supposedly there was a joke about one of the delegates, his last name is Gary, Gerry, and he was supposedly, very thin, maybe kind of a frail man, and they were kind of joking with him about he was going to have the roughest lot because if they hung him, he was just going to kind of blow around for a while and not die. I mean, this is the type of gallows humor that you would hope maybe people cope with this incredible stress using this gallows humor. And so here they are cracking jokes when they just declared independence from Great Britain, and they have to feel the weight of the British Navy. I mean, many of those that had served in the 7 Years' War, what we call the French and Indian War, alongside British manpower, had seen their resources. They knew what was coming, and yet they declared independence. What an incredible moment. So at the very beginning of the United States, we were not born from certainty of success, but from conviction that certain truths were worth defending regardless of the cost. And so we are a nation born out of courage, born out of determination, out of principle. Now, did we fully express that principle in our founding? No, we've talked about that other places, and this idea of human freedom being created equal has worked out over time. We fought the Civil War over slavery. We'll get to that in a little bit. But at the founding of the United States, you see this incredible conviction and courage in defending that regardless of the cost. What an incredible start to the United States of America. The second one that I will talk about that still shocks individuals as we study history, as I get to know human nature, as I work in politics or in the public square. This particular event just becomes more and more remarkable to me. And so the second one is that George Washington resigned his commission in 1783. If you study history all of the time, you have those that are in command of the army. Once they win, what happens? Well, they become king because, they have all the guns, right? And so after defeating Britain, Washington was arguably and almost certainly the most respected man in America. That's why he would lead the Constitutional Convention. He would go on to be the first president. His soldiers were loyal to him. And again, many victorious generals throughout history have seized power. And what did Washington do? Famously, like the great Cincinnatus before him, he just wanted to go back to Mount Vernon. He just wanted to go home. And you actually see this throughout the rest of his public life. Constitutional Convention, becoming president, he's deeply in debt. He just wants to go back to the farm. And he keeps getting pulled back into public life. But what an incredible moment. And to make matters worse, I find this somewhat humorous. And this also is just human nature. All right, so Congress asks him basically to come, and they're probably a little tentative, like, what is Washington going to do at this point? We're Congress, but he leads the military arm. And so they told him that when he came, he would need to resign his commission, and then he would need to bow to Congress, in a sense kind of showing their authority. And so what a passive-aggressive thing to do. But again, this is public life. And so he comes to Congress, and it says that his voice, by historians, his voice faltered and sunk. And then he was shedding tears. He's crying. He gave this famous address, but he finished it by saying, "Having now finished the work assigned me, I retire from the great theater of action, and bidding an affectionate farewell to this august body, under whose orders I have so long acted, I here offer my commission and take my leave of all the employments of public life." Body, not buddy there. It's earlier in the morning here. All right, so interesting. Washington did, in fact, bow after this speech. And how he had to humble himself to do that. Here are these passive-aggressive politicians, and he actually does bow, hands in his commission, and retires from public life. King George III reportedly remarked, because he heard rumors that this was true, and he thought, no way, that's actually not what happened. He remarked that if Washington did this, he will be the greatest man in the world. And so Washington here, he takes this military commission. He could have had control, and the United States begins under control of Congress, not a king, showing once again our great dedication to this republic. So in this particular lesson, we learn kind of humility and restraint. Is there any greater test of character than willingly surrendering power? How hard is that to do? And this moment established civilian control of the military, demonstrated that power exists to serve the republic, not the ruler. And even to this day, we still have peaceful exchanges of power. here in the United States. People will bring up January 6th, but that's a sore point. But we still have peaceful exchanges of power. There's no military coup going on. And even as difficult as our disagreements are, we are still, as a nation, committed to peaceful transfer of power. And Washington starts this. This is incredible in world history. And so that's the beginning. That's the example that was set. So what a remarkable moment. The third one that I'll mention is America Goes to the Camp, or America's kind of camp meeting, the idea of the Second Great Awakening. And I did title this as particular moments. And there is kind of the Cane Ridge Revival, where something like 10,000 to 30,000 folks show up. And that's kind of the moment. But it is a little bit broader, this one, in the Second Great Awakening. But it is so formative in America's public life and the future of our country. And there are differing accounts as to how religious Americans were during the time of the Revolution, the American War for Independence. But certainly as America begins to push west, there's a lot of Enlightenment ideas. But then this is hard. This is a frontier town. And the Second Great Awakening sweeps through the young republic via camp meetings, revivals, frontier preaching. You have leaders such as Francis Asbury, Barton Stone, Charles Finney. This inspires church planting, missions, education, charitable organizations, and also social reform. And you think about the Cane Ridge Revival, again, 10,000 to 30,000. This is the frontier. And so as the United States is developing into this young nation, so the Constitution passes, it gets ratified, and now the Constitution requires a moral and religious people. As Adams would say, if you don't have that, it's going to be like a whale going through a net. And so you have to have a populace, you have to have a citizenry that is moral and religious, that it has self-control. Self-governance requires self-control. And so as the United States begins to grow, the Second Great Awakening happens. Thousands and thousands of people come to Christ, and you see a real change in our nation. I have been encouraged as I've traveled, even in the Northwest, parts of the old Northwest Territory, Ohio, Indiana, down into Kentucky, and the Cane Ridge Revival was in Kentucky. There are churches that were actually planted by circuit riding preachers. This is incredible, from all that time ago. And I've actually been to churches. This was interesting. Churches that, because they were smaller, they're like up in the hills. They couldn't get a circuit rider from their particular denomination there every week. So they would have folks come in from different denominations, say Methodist, Baptist, Presbyterian, very different than those, the way they are today. And that those churches, I think, often called union churches, and someone can let me know if I misstated that. But that's the old, circuit riding preacher type of history that we have here. And again, there are churches that were actually founded by these individuals that would put a Bible in a saddle. They would hit the road. They would go around preaching the gospel. And so this Second Great Awakening sweeps the United States late 1700s into the early 1800s, and is really formative. There's kind of three phases. The first was the frontier kind of camp meetings. The second is more in the congregational churches of New England. And then you have Charles Finney, which is in kind of western New York, but eventually revival meetings in the largest cities in the United States and Britain. And so thousands and thousands of Americans come to Christ in what we call the Second Great Awakening. So the moment is really, I think, that kind of Cane Ridge Revival, but also it's just the Baptists, the Methodists pushing into the frontier, and America kind of goes to camp. America has this massive revival. And one of the things about the Second Great Awakening that is somewhat different than the first is that it not only had people coming to Jesus, but also it fueled movements where people kind of woke up to, I need to be a follower of Jesus. And hey, we actually shouldn't be, owning people. And so it led to abolition. It led to efforts to address other social problems as well. And so you begin to see some of these social efforts, things like how are husbands treating their wives? How is the society treating the poor? Those sorts of things. And so you begin to see some social reform sparked by the Second Great Awakening. And so here you see the Constitution provided a framework for self-government, but the Second Great Awakening sought to cultivate the moral character necessary for self-government to succeed. And it reinforced the idea that ordinary citizens could influence both their communities and the nation's future. So that a question, can a free people remain free without being virtuous? And is virtue possible without relationship with Christ? I think the answer to that is no. And so the Second Great Awakening sets us on a strong footing. And as we think about our own day, I pray for that type of move of the Holy Spirit, that type of move of the Lord, and a revival in our nation today. We definitely need that. So that was the third one. So we had Declaration of Independence, Washington resigns his commission, and America goes to camp, the camp meeting in a sense, the Second Great Awakening. The next one I will say is Lincoln's Second Inaugural Address in 1865. So I am kind of skipping ahead a little bit. And just the heartbreak of our great Civil War, fought over slavery. And people will argue it for, it's about slavery, is it about states' rights? Well, what was the state right that so many of the Confederate states mentioned in their declarations and their succession documents? Well, it was slavery, right? And so this is inescapable, that there's going to be this war over this at some point. You see it in the founding documents where the founders are trying to hold it together. They're trying to keep it together, and it's that political reality that they're looking at. I think that tempers some of those documents, and you have the real challenge of that social and political moment where the founders are trying to hold those things together. But alas, they can't hold it together long enough. Lincoln gets elected. By the time he's there for his first inaugural, essentially everything's in motion for this terrible Civil War. And you think about the personal ramifications of brother fighting brother, family fighting family. And in few places was this as acute as Kentucky, where Mary Todd Lincoln, Lincoln's wife, was from. And it's fascinating because I live in Indiana, but we go down to Kentucky, to Louisville from time to time. And in Madison, you have actual abolitionist churches, part of the Underground Railroad. You go down to Louisville, and there was actually a slave market there in Louisville. And so even that history kind of just still sits there. Both Lincoln and Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy, were born in Kentucky. And there's this story about Emily Todd Helm, who had been Mary Todd Lincoln's half-sister. So, this is in the middle of the Civil War, 1863. So Emily Helm's husband was a Confederate officer. His name was Benjamin Hardin Helm. He died at the Battle of Chickamauga. So Emily Todd Helm is now a widow. So what does she do? Well, she wants to go stay with family. Well, who's her family? Mary Todd Lincoln, her half-sister. So Emily Todd Helm actually comes and stays at the White House. All right, she's a Confederate widow. You thought, Thanksgiving might have been awkward, and there are stories. This is kind of played out in the great book called Team of Rivals about Lincoln and his cabinet, and they're coming in like, what is she doing here? What in the world? And this just highlights the heartbreak of our Civil War. And so the Lincoln's Second Inaugural Address, given in 1865, the Civil War's nearing its end. This moment, I mentioned it's a moment. It's this fascinating moment. We described it a little bit in the expose, the podcast episode on Frederick Douglass, where Douglass is in the audience. Douglass is this great voice of abolitionists. He's an escaped slave, and he's the fiery prophet of freedom. And Vice President Andrew Johnson, he's from Tennessee, and there's going to be bad blood. There's going to be a lot of history there coming from Andrew Johnson, and it appears that Lincoln actually kind of pointed Douglass out to Johnson, and it's kind of like a sickly, sweet smile or something. And, there's things happening there. And so Douglass is in the audience. And you think of Lincoln in this moment. One, it's amazing how brief Lincoln's speeches are, and yet they're the historic ones. Maybe I should take a note about that, all right? But he steps up to the podium, and you think of all that he could say. And there's the photo of this moment you can find online. And so he goes down through a couple of preliminaries, but then I wanted to read a little bit more of this for us, because again, you just think of the moment there. 1/8 of the whole population were colored slaves, not distributed generally over the Union, but localized in the southern part of it. These slaves constituted a peculiar and powerful interest. All knew that this interest was somehow the cause of the war. To strengthen, perpetuate, and extend this interest was the object for which the insurgents would rend the Union even by war, while the government claimed no right to do more than to restrict the territorial enlargement of it. Neither party expected for the war the magnitude or the duration which it has already attained. Neither anticipated that the cause of the conflict might cease with, or even before the conflict itself should cease. Each looked for an easier triumph and a result less fundamental and astounding. Both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. It may seem strange that any men should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces, but let us judge not, that we be not judged. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. The Almighty has his own purposes. Woe unto the world because of offenses. For it must needs to be that offenses come, but woe to that man by whom the offense comes. If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which in the providence of God must needs come, but which, having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible war, as the woe due to those by whom the offense came, shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to him? Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. We've talked about that passage before, this theodicy of the Civil War. But then he concludes with this incredible phrase, with this incredible paragraph, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Again, these profound words, with malice toward none, with charity for all. Of course, an assassin's bullet would end Lincoln's life soon after. And one of the great, and I really wrestle with this. I mean, one of the great what-ifs of American history is what if Lincoln had lived and he had partnered with Douglas and others to create this just and lasting peace. And instead, you see, even despite the Civil War amendments, kind of the second founding, many of those rights and the freedom that had been promised to the slaves, to the freedmen, snaps back into Jim Crow, and Reconstruction Jim Crow, and over 100 years before the Civil Rights Act passes there in the 1960s. And so there's this just incredible moment. Here is Lincoln. I mean, the nation has been rent by a civil war, and yet he calls for charity for all and malice towards none. And so he calls us to heal after a very profound division. And there's this moment, it's described some in A Team of Rivals, but the armies of the Union actually have this grand ceremony at the end of the Civil War, and it's muted somewhat. It's this. I almost would have loved to have been there, because this isn't a ticker tape parade. You didn't conquer, some evil empire across the waves. Like you had to fight family over this grave moral evil. And hundreds of thousands of Americans have died. It's ripped the country apart. And here you have this grand parade of the bayonets, glinting in the sun, the clop of the horses' hooves, the rattle of the cannons, as this grand army of the Republic that defended liberty, kind of marches off and then is mustered out, and all of those soldiers go back into the heartland of the United States. And it's this moment, but it's muted because, their great captain is dead. He's not there to see it. And so it's this moment in American history of lost chances, what could have happened, but also a call by a president soon to be felled by an assassin's bullet for charity and for mercy and to heal despite profound division. Again, what an incredible moment in American history. The next one that I will mention is America's perseverance in World War II, especially in the year 1942. So if you remember, in December of 1941, you have Japan attack Pearl Harbor, damaged or sank much of the Pacific battleship fleet, shocked the nation. So you enter 1942 with that happening. Of course, the war is declared on Japan, And one of the perhaps great blunders of history, Hitler just goes out and declares war on the United States. Right? So now you're suddenly in a global war on two fronts against Japan and Germany. And our allies, at the time, Russia is completely straining against the Nazis that have attacked their homeland, and it looks like they're going to fall. England is on their tiny island, and Winston Churchill has sent the English language to war, but they're barely hanging on. So at that moment in history, who had the power, who had the resources to fight a two-front global war other than the United States? But we look back on, we won that war, no big deal. But just think of what happened in 1942. There's a great book on this, just titled 1942, and you read it, and you can just feel the weight of defeat after defeat. American and Filipino forces were overwhelmed. Bataan fell in 1942, April. Corregidor fell in May. Tens of thousands endured the death march. Japan conquered Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies. There's threats to Australia. Germany appeared dominant in Europe. They controlled most of continental Europe. France had fallen. The Soviet Union was suffering enormous losses. German forces were advancing toward the Caucasus and Stalingrad. And despite that, here you have, it looked like all was lost. And finally, in the summer of 1942, and I'd encourage you, if you have a chance to watch the movie Midway, this is the turning point, right? And the bravery of American pilots, the ingenuity of our intelligence, how we're able to, in a sense, kind of trick the Japanese to come. And this one pilot, his name is Best, he basically sinks two Japanese aircraft carriers in one day. So what incredible moments, but these were not assured. And this shows us kind of a grit, a dedication. So despite all that happened, America emerges, all right? We build up, we become the great arsenal of democracy. And then we emerge from all of that with unmatched economic strength. Of course, the great question of whether we use the atomic weapon or not, the firebombing of the cities, what it would have happened to the Japanese populace if we had invaded, the number of lives lost, but we used the atomic weapons. And so essentially we emerged from World War II with unrivaled economic strength and no power that could challenge it directly. Now, you could argue the Soviet Union had built up, that's true, but the Soviet Union did not have atomic weapons. And this is the moment that I really wanted to emphasize. It's the grit to come through World War II, but I don't know that we talk about this enough. We had atomic weapons. We had a monopoly on atomic weapons. What would an Alexander the Great or a Genghis Khan or a Caesar or a Stalin or a Hitler, what would any of those individuals have done if they had a weapon that could end worlds? And instead of creating an empire, we helped rebuild former enemies through efforts such as the Marshall Plan. Now, certainly that benefited us economically, but when we criticize the United States, when we bring up some of the past, certainly around slavery, discrimination, I do think it's important that we also note we passed the atomic test. All right, and you think about developing tools, developing weapons, AI, who knows what's next, but to have a moment of unmatched military superiority where we literally could have used it to control the globe, and instead we went out and rebuilt the economies of our former enemies, that's a grand moment. That's something worth celebrating. It's strength under control. And so when you have extraordinary power, how do you use it? How do you steward it? And we've done this well before. It's strength under control. It's using it to even bless our former enemies. Now, again, there's the 1942, there's the atomic test. So when people begin to push back on American history, I like to bring this one up, and also the 9,389 graves there in Normandy, where we spent our blood and our treasure, the lives of our young men to end a fascist regime. That is noble. Imperfect but impressive. This is impressive stuff. Again, it's one of these moments in history. Like, you read the books, and anybody that has military superiority uses it for empire, for their own glory, for their own ends, and yet we actually went out to rebuild our former enemies, the economies of our former enemies. We passed the atomic test. The last one that I'll mention is Apollo 11 lands on the moon. So, here we are, As human beings throughout the ages, we've looked up at the stars, we've looked at the moon, and we wondered. But this is a significant moment. This is a moment as Americans we should be proud of. I think of the recent Artemis missions. We have gone into the stars. And there's this specific moment. Listening to the transcript, the radio broadcast of this is incredible. So you have Apollo 11. All right, we've done the testing. We're going to go land on the moon. And this is 1969 technology. I mean, like a tin can. Our smartphones have, computing power that's incredible in comparison to some of these computers, and yet these men are risking their lives. And so in the final descent, there's this unexpected 12:02 computer alarm that sounds, and of course the astronauts are like, "What is this?" And I don't know if I was an astronaut there. If I'm Neil Armstrong, I would have been just losing it. I'm like, what is this? We don't know what's going to happen. All right, and so he just calmly can't see it. They're upside down. I mean, they can't see anything, and just very calmly turns, lands past the boulders, comes safely to rest. And then here comes, the famous words, Houston, Tranquility Base here, the Eagle has landed. And the famous line, one small step for man, one giant leap for humankind. So for mankind. And there's also this great plaque that's there on the lander. Here, men from planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind. And so even in that, we're thinking kind of about humankind, right? And so this incredible moment where we reach another world, and best I understand, that particular flag, was planted. It fell over as the rocket blasted off. And then there have been other flags that have been planted there. And so we've literally planted our flag, again, from 13 small colonies with a bunch of guys that got together. Hey, we believe in this principle strongly enough to pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor against this overwhelming foe, the greatest empire then on earth. And fast forward all these years, and even in the scope of history, not thousands of years, it's 1969. So you have 1776 and 1969. In this very small window, we have flight, we have going to the moon, we have human freedom. And so in this, there's the American spirit of vision and exploration. This was a combination of courage, ingenuity, scientific excellence, and willingness to attempt what had never been done before. And so where are the frontiers still that remain worthy of our great national effort? We see the vision and exploration. So these are, again, just 6 moments. I hope that as a fellow American, again, it feels a little muted. Like, can we be proud? Can we do this? Yeah, we recognize that we're sinners and we failed at times, but can we celebrate this? Like, absolutely. You think about the Declaration and the incredible story of courage and commitment to principle. Washington's resignation, teaching restraint and dedication to the American experiment and ordered liberty. The Second Great Awakening, teaching moral formation and the importance of the transformation of relationship with Jesus Christ, and then how that impacts our citizenry it creates great citizens, it creates good citizens that then go out and impact their society for good. Lincoln's Second Inaugural, teaching charity and unity despite great division and great loss, and the vision of what could have happened if that vision had been fully realized, encouraging us today to continue to work towards that full view of the fact that we are all created equal. The World War II of just grit and willingness to take blow after blow after blow and to just stand up again and keep going against the odds, and it looked almost impossible. And here's the United States fighting a global 2-front war and coming out on top. And then even with the atomic weapon in hand, it teaches responsible power, responsible use of power. So grit and determination, responsible use of power. And then that moon landing, vision and ingenuity, and always reaching, for the stars, thinking outside of the box, thinking and dreaming about what we can do as humans and as American. There's a line, and it comes from the days of kind of McCarthy and the big, the Red Scare. So it was said in that context, but I think this statement is true broadly, and it helps capture some of what I've talked about today. And the line goes like this: "We will not be driven by fear into an age of unreason. if we dig deep in our history and our doctrine and remember that we are not descended from fearful men, not from men who fear to write, to speak, to associate, and defend causes which were for the moment unpopular. So I love that line, that remember that we are not descended from fearful men and, of course, women. And you think about that frontier spirit, whether it was to the moon or across the prairies. We have been a nation of pioneers, a nation of risk takers, a nation of visionaries, a nation of individuals that were moral and self-controlled, and that allowed us to accomplish these great things. So taken together, these 6 moments suggest that America's greatest achievements were not just merely military, political, or technological. There were moments when principle, character, and purpose shaped the nation's actions at pivotal points in history. And so this, I think, is the greatest lesson of all from all of this, that yes, it was going to the moon. It was signing a document that teed up a war with the greatest force on earth, but it just really came back to we're people that are dedicated to the principle that all men are created equal. And we have character. We have our beliefs rooted in Judeo-Christian and specifically biblical principles, and that we're willing to go to the mat for those. And because of those, because we know that we live in a world created by a just and good God, we dream about a day when we know utopia is not going to come, but when these things are more fully realized. And why do we look around us, even on planet Earth, and think, oh, we're bound here? Like, no, we can dream beyond that. So for all of those reasons, I think America is worth celebrating. And so as we celebrate, we kind of count down towards the 250th anniversary of our great country. I wanted to look back at some of these important moments and think about the American story and how it can inspire us to continue to impact our particular zip code, to be dedicated to these principles, to show purpose, but also to dream and to work for a better tomorrow. So I'm grateful for the United States, and we'll continue celebrating that this month. We'll talk with you next week.